For the whole podcast in English, please fast forward a little bit. It's a Brazilian Portuguese introduction. Gravei hoje com o Zietsman. Ele foi o criador e o autor do livro que fala sobre o Ultradenso. São mudanças de paradigma muito grande com relação ao jeito que a gente opera as propriedades rurais. O primeiro deles é que a gente passa a pensar a máxima lucratividade ecológica por área. A segunda é que a gente passa a usar os animais com a genética o mais adaptada possível para o nosso próprio contexto. A terceira é que a gente promove uma utilização das forragens completa, o pastejo não seletivo. Esse conjunto de coisas constitui uma abordagem, não é só uma ferramenta de colheita de pastagem. A gente conversou sobre essa mudança, a gente conversou sobre a dificuldade que algumas pessoas têm, produtores e consultores, de entender a máxima lucratividade por área. Ele vem trazendo essa questão do ultradenso desde 1995 e mostrando que, em muitos casos, dá para mais do que dobrar a taxa de lotação na propriedade. Então, uma das coisas que a gente conversou, e ele explicou muito bem, é que, por exemplo, se você aumenta 2 vezes mais o número de animais que você tem na propriedade em função da possibilidade que essa abordagem traz. Mesmo que alguns animais, ou todos os animais, tenham uma perda de 30% de performance, você dobrou a sua lucratividade. Então, é uma questão mais pragmática e um olhar mais integral para a propriedade. Quando a gente olha para o animal, a performance animal, a gente é muito mais facilmente levado aos insumos. E quando a gente olha para a lucratividade máxima por área, a gente é mais facilmente levado a cortar custos e cuidar mais da propriedade. Inclusive, ao final do podcast, ele fala que nós temos um dever moral de usar os animais para melhorar as propriedades onde a gente produz e habita. Veja, é um dever moral deixar o lugar melhor para outras gerações. E é totalmente possível fazer isso com a integração animal, com uma pecuária, com uma abordagem ecológica. Então deixei o podcast para vocês com o Johann Zietsman, o criador do Ultradenso, e o autor do livro, do mesmo nome, Ultradenso, um livro muito bacana que eu recomendo muito para vocês. É uma mudança de paradigma muito grande com relação ao manejo de pastagens e a propriedade como um todo. Abraço. All right, Mr. Zietsman, thank you very much for your time, for your book, for your dedication to ranching, and also for your contribution to the way we see the role of livestock in our farms. I'm very pleased to have this time to talk to you, record this conversation to bring your knowledge and your wisdom to other people, especially to Brazilian people. So some of my questions, I suppose, will be directed to your experience and opinions about Brazilian ranching. Recently, you quoted John Acocks. Is that how you pronounce his name?
That's right, John Acocks.
Yeah. You said that South Africa, or he said that South Africa is overgrazed and understocked. Is that
exactly?
Is that pretty much the X-ray of most ranches around the world? Do you think?
Absolutely. We have too few cattle overgrazing a small percentage of grasses, and not grazing other grasses. So overall, we have a very poor utilization of grass and have a negative effect on the grazing.
How was your story as a young rancher? How you ended up in this path of discovering ultra high density was a solution for this situation?
Okay, well, I have to go back. As a teenager, I can remember I was very interested in what I'm doing now, and in other words, using cattle to improve the land and breeding cattle that are efficient grass converters. So I've always been interested, and I've been in contact with a lot of people. Acocks was the first person I'd read about that made sense to me. Allan Savory made realize that you have to have high densities to improve the land. So that's basically, from the grazing point of view, it was Acocks and Allan Savory that got me onto the right track. And then on the cattle side, I studied under Jan Bonsma, Professor Jan Bonsma from Pretoria University, and I was also involved with, connected with Tom Lasseter in America of Beefmaster fame. So those 4 people really affected the way I was thinking. And then after finishing university, I did a 4-year degree, and I was invited to stay on and become a lecturer. And I said, thank you very much, but I prefer to go and do things on the land. And that's where my learning process started, when I started ranching myself. And it took me a long time with all these ideas in the background of my head. The big problem, Eureka, was to get the high densities on a practical scale. That was a major breakthrough that I made in 1995 when I started using electric fences. So it took me a long time. But from the 12th of January 1995, it put me in a totally different trajectory, where I saw that by using cattle at high densities, I was utilizing the grass much better and improving the land. So that's actually when it started, 1995, 12th of January.
It seems to me you were very wise in absorbing from all these sources. It seems to me that you absorbed important elements to come up with an approach that would integrate all of these, because Savory talks about densities as a tool, animal impact.
Yes.
But it's not he doesn't preconize that all the time. He uses animal impact, but he doesn't manage the herds in ultra high densities all the time. Am I?
Yes, you're right. You're 100% right. He started off from a wildlife point of view. So from him, his starting point was to use cattle as a tool to improve the land. So basically, they were just using the mouths and hooves to try and improve the land. But even then, he couldn't go to these extreme high densities, which is needed in some areas. But he didn't realize that you also need cattle to make a living. You have to make money. So there's really other aspects in terms of cattle management and breeding that he didn't understand. He may understand it now, but at the time that I was involved with him, he didn't understand that. So I went on a different course. But I learned a lot from Allan Savory, and I give him credit for it, because he made us aware of the value of impact. But no one could go to those high impacts until I did it in the 12th of January 1995. And when I'm talking about impacts, I'm talking about stock densities of between 1,000 and 5,000 animals per hectare. So it's one animal to 10 square meters or one animal to 2 square meters. That's the sort of density that I required in my tropical environment, with very poor quality grazing and tall grasses and compacted soil.
Another element that was another element that at my judgment, I perceive it's lacking from his approach that you brought in, maybe from Bonsma, was the genetic adaptation to do that, because not all cattle, exactly, not all animals can do that, can they?
100%. It's all about the two things that the foundation of cattle selection, and that's inherent body condition and hormonal balance. In other words, those two combined together will give you high fertility, which is the most important determinant, the most important trait that cattle require. The most important determinant for profitability is stocking rate. But what was lacking was the inherent body condition. In other words, to be able to get cattle to produce under those non-selective conditions, you'd have to feed them a lot. So inherent body condition is very important.
And fertility will follow from inherent body condition because of the fat.
Exactly. Inherent body condition, most cattle are to a certain degree hormonally balanced. What is lacking in practical conditions is inherent body condition. So it's body condition. So it's either inherent or you have to feed. Breed or feed for body condition. And breeding obviously is a better option.
Yeah, I'll circle back to that, but I want to emphasize, because you seem to have a very special eye for things, because Bonsma, he was very good at visual appraisal, wasn't he? Because he measured for a long time, so he got very proficient in evaluating animals from a visual appraisal. Am I correct to say that?
That is correct, but one has to keep in mind that the visual appraisal that he was involved with was to do with fertility. And from a cow point of view, it's historical. So a fertile cow that's had calved at a young age and had several calves will look very different to a cow that has calved at a later age and has had fewer calves. But that's historical. But from a production point of view or selection point of view, we can measure that before we need to historically identify those cows. So it was very interesting, but from a practical point of view, there's not much value in that, in identifying animals. I think the biggest mistake Bonsma made was in the selection, where they selected for growth rate and so-called feed conversion efficiency, and that's negatively correlated to inherent body condition. And that's where the problem arose in conventional selection, is that we selected against inherent body condition.
Would you think that that was a mistake of the industry, or do you think that the industry was geared towards this sort of metrics because they were using ranches to market grains? Do you think it was by chance, or do you think this was by design?
I think it was because of the emphasis on feedlotting cattle. That's where the problem arose. So they started selecting cattle that needed a feedlot to be fed. If you've got cattle with high inherent body condition, you don't need to put them in a feedlot. You can fatten them with grass or grass plus a supplement. So it was because of the feedlot industry in America, and everyone followed the Americans.
From your work, I have the perception that you care a lot for the well-being and the economic viability of the farmers themselves. When you have cattle that can only gain body condition on feedlots, it's the feedlot that makes the money, but not the rancher. Am I correct to say so?
Exactly. That is correct, yes. So if you have a genotype that's efficient in the feedlot, the equivalent in the cow side would be very inefficient on grass because you have to feed those animals to get them in good enough body condition to conceive.
Would you say that from Professor Bonsma, what was the main take from there? Because it seems that from Acocks and from Savory, you got that we were overgrazed and understocked in a similar way. From both of them, you got the same sort of idea. But I think from Bonsma, Professor Bonsma, it was a different lesson, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It mainly what I got from him, a couple of things. One was the importance of adaptation, which is both climatic and adaptation to parasites and disease, or resistance to parasites and disease. But what was lacking, what they didn't understand, I think, generally speaking, at that stage, and I would include Jan Bonsma in that category, they didn't understand the importance of nutritional adaptation, which is related to inherent body condition. That was the main characteristic that was missing in their selection.
And on top of genetic adaptation, extremely good inherent body condition will eventually make the animal more resistant to parasites anyway, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, that's part of it, because inherent body condition is related to a smaller frame. It's related to parasite disease resistance. In other words, an animal that has less parasites and less disease will have a higher intake. And the other factor that's very important is the individual appetite. Some animals just have a more aggressive behavior, grazing behavior, so they eat more. So efficiency is related to the amount of grass or feed you take in relative to body size. So it's related to those four factors.
Again, just to emphasize that, because you started using electric fence and it's extremely high densities. We need genetics that's adapted to that management. And on top of that, you need, like you said, climatic adaptation. You need parasite resistance. But very early on, you were against all of the drenches and dipping and all of the chemicals. Why you think you went, let's say, against the grain with that? Because when you were talking against these things, they were very prevalent everywhere.
Yes, that's exactly so. I grew up in an environment where, in our situation, by law, we had to dip our cattle once a week because of tick-borne diseases that were introduced, mainly because of the European type breeds that we had in Africa that were unadapted. So we had to dip them. And I saw very early on, because we were plunge dipping the cattle, and every now and again you'd have a calf that wouldn't be able to swim very well and would eventually drown in the dip. So that calf, you put a notch in the ear, and when that calf came to the dip the next week, you wouldn't dip it. And that calf became a cow that was never dipped. And they came to the dip every week with the other cattle, never dipped and never had ticks on them. So I realized very quickly that most animals, to a certain degree, are able to repel ticks. The problem is that if they're not challenged enough by ticks, those mechanisms, the genetic mechanisms, don't work. I think it's to do with epigenetics. So I saw that very on. So I realized that there were animals that were resistant, and also calves have an inherent resistance to tick-borne diseases as calves. So that window period up to about 8 months, if you didn't dip the calves and they became in contact with diseases, they picked up immunity. And to keep that immunity, we'd have to keep dipping them very infrequently and have ticks on them to keep the immunity up. So that's what I did in 1998, sorry. From then on, I didn't dip my cattle, or very infrequently dipped them. And then I also realized I needed more indigenous blood into my cattle. And that's when I started using more indigenous breeds like the Mashona and Buran.
What brought me to your work was actually an indication from Aline, she's in your group. I was writing a project. I was building a business with sheep, and having lived outside of Brazil and having studied under some of the Allan Savory's teachers, I knew I needed to measure my animals in order to cut costs. But I wasn't quite sure what I needed to measure. It wasn't clear to me what should I look for. And then I spoke to her, and she said, don't go for EPDs. They're no good. Have a look at Zietsman's work, because I think you like it. And one of the things that I like, not only the approach, but the autonomy, the freedom that brings to farmers that can breed their own animals. That was a very, I suppose, and I want to hear from you, but I suppose it was a big leap from mainstream when you start doing that, wasn't it? Because people are very attached to breeds.
Very attached to breeds and very hesitant to so-called crossbreed, because if you have a crossbred animal, they think it won't breed true, which is not true. It's totally not true. So every individual like you with your sheep, and me with my cattle, and anyone else who's got cattle, they can breed an animal that's adapted to their conditions by combining several genotypes or several breeds. Absolutely, no doubt about that.
And then it comes to this mix, the visual appraisal. It comes the history of the female, the dam or the cow. Yes. But you approach very precisely also sexual dimorphism that comes from inherited body condition. Is that so?
It's in combination, yes. So from the cow point of view, the one metric that is very important for me is the age of second calving. In other words, the earlier a cow can calve and reconceive again, the more fertile that cow is. So that gives you an indication of your most fertile cows from which you can select your bulls. And the other very important thing is that at a yearling age, we need to measure the maturity rate of our bulls, not the size, but the growth rate relative to size, which is quite easy to do. You can do it visually. The fuller the package is, as a yearling, the more efficient that animal is. And then what is very important, and I think is lacking absolutely everywhere, is that before we do major selections in terms of our bulls, we have to first multi-sire as yearlings, or as young as possible. So rather, because the biggest problem we have is to get those cows that calve early and reconceive again. And that's related to body condition, inherent body condition, and hormonal balance. So with multi-siring, at a yearling age or very young age, you will identify the bulls that are capable at that age to give you the most calves. And if you can identify those bulls, then you can further select them for whatever you require, whether it's meat to bone ratio, muscling, temperament, whatever. And then you identify those bulls, and then the most fertile bulls that have the attributes that you require, and you can inseminate on a very large scale with those bulls for 1 year, and you replace them again with younger progeny.
Again,
so that's basically what it is.
When we talk about the fuller package, people sometimes, I don't know if it's a mental laziness or whatever it is, but they keep repeating that you're selecting for smaller size, and that's not true. You're not selecting for smaller sizes. You're selecting for the heaviest the heaviest in relation to maturity.
Its size. Yes, or heaviest in relation to frame size. Hip height, for instance. That's exactly true. But the thing is, nature selects for the size, not us. So we have to allow nature to define which animals in our environment, depending on the nutrition, are the right size. So we're not selecting for smaller animals. We're selecting for more efficient animals, and they would generally be a smaller frame, but relative to their size, they will be heavier.
Yeah, I had this conversation with a few people. They mistakenly think that we are selecting for smaller animals. It's not what it is.
Not at all. No, we're not selecting for small animals, but they will be smaller, generally speaking, because with the current selection criteria that we use conventionally, we're selecting automatically for larger animals. But in our situation, we're selecting for more efficient animals, which will be a smaller frame, generally speaking, but they will be heavier relative to that frame, a fuller package.
When you talk about grass conversion efficiency, it brings me to another topic. When I talk about ultra high density grazing with some people, they define it as simply as a tool to better harvest grasses. And I'm sorry, you created it, but I don't agree with that. I think it's an approach, because it's not the efficiency is a tool that you are looking for from a perspective of maximum profit per acre. It's not the end. It's a means to an end.
So there's two things. One is grass utilization, which is very important, but that's a byproduct of ultra high density grazing, which is required to improve the land as well. So automatically you'll get better grass utilization. But it's that grass that's utilized that has to be converted to efficiency, and that relates to inherent body condition, and then further relates to fertility. That's where the efficiency comes in.
It's a paradigm change for most people to think about maximum sustainable profit per area instead of maximum performance per animal. And it seems to me that you departed from an understanding that you need to improve your land in order to be profitable in the long run.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, the starting point was, for me, was that cattle have a dual role. That's very important to understand that. We need cattle that can efficiently convert grass into a product that we can sell, whether it's milk or beef or wool or whatever the case may be. But we also need to use those cattle, the mouths and hooves, to improve the land. So they have a dual purpose. That's very, very important. And once you understand that, and then it relates to profit per hectare as well. But the biggest paradigm shift is to go from profit or production per animal to sustainable profit, ecologically and economically sustainable profit per unit.
I think one of the things you said that made me realize that was when you compared if ranchers were to ranch in the same way that if someone that produces corn was to produce corn the same way that ranchers produce cattle.
Yes.
Can you comment on that? Because I think that yes, metaphor brings it very clearly the mistake.
Yes. Yes. Most crop people growing crops like corn, for instance, their production goal would be tons per hectare or profit per hectare. So if you had the cattleman's point of view as a crop farmer, then you would plant your plants 2 or 3 meters apart, and you get very big cobs, but you'd have a very low production per acre. It's the same thing.
A good way to go broke very fast.
Very, very fast. Yes, exactly, and you're not improving the land.
Yes. Yeah, it is, for me, it was a paradigm shift, and also the capacity to have a genetic development protocol that serves my land, that I'm capable of managing, evaluating, and choosing without the need for experts. So that was
exactly. No, you're 100% correct. That is a big paradigm shift. We have to understand that in terms of management and breeding, we have to enhance natural processes. So by using cattle as mouths and hooves, we enhance the effectiveness of rainfall, the soil fertility, the utilization of grass, photosynthetic efficiency, etc. And also the rumen of the cattle. We have to enhance the rumen, the digestion of the rumen. That's from a management point of view. And from a breeding point of view, we have to allow nature to decide which are the most efficient animals. So we have to allow nature to tell us which are the more efficient animals. And from our point of view as a breeder, the only role we can play is to accelerate natural selection.
And in doing that way, we are also fostering a natural selection that is specific to our place. Is that correct?
100% correct, yes. 100% correct.
The most fertile ewe or cow will be the one that comes to heat sooner in our environment. The most adapted one is the one that conceives again faster.
Exactly. 100%. Very simple. You see, we get caught up with these EPDs, we get caught up in detail. The way we're looking at selection now is we're looking at it from a very big picture far away. We're looking at an outcome. We're not looking at detail. To put all those detail together is very, very difficult. It's impossible. But looking at an outcome, in other words, fertility or whatever the case may be, the outcome is there very, very obvious. So we select for the outcome.
And I like that one of the outcomes is maximum sustainable profit per acre, because if you can't have that, you can't stay in business.
100%, and you're not improving your land. If your goal was production per animal, there's no chance you will use those cattle to graze non-selectively to improve your land.
Well, now you touch upon an issue that it's interesting, because most people that they argue for selective grazing, usually their metrics is performance per animal. They can't understand performance per area.
No, they can't. No, that's 100%. So if your goal is max profit per animal or production per animal, you will need to graze selectively, which is very inefficient, and it degrades the land.
What's the risk of having a high density but not high enough? Because I think that happens very frequently.
Particularly in more humid environments like you have and what we have here, you can go to a high density, maybe 200 or 300 animals per hectare, and they will foul that area because they've still got area to move around in. So they will still, within that small area, they will select and move around. So what they will do is they will foul that area through dust or dung or urine, or when it rains, the grass becomes fouled and they won't eat that grass. So the density is too high in terms of fouling, but not high enough to mitigate the fouling. So if you go to extremely high density, say from 200 animals per hectare to 2,000 animals per hectare, the area is very small and the animals just stand and they have to eat what's in front of them, and then you have to move them very quickly. And by doing that, you're stimulating their intake as well, because you're moving them into fresh grazing all the time. So you're getting a very high utilization without losing too much body condition.
Yeah, I'm still struggling to achieve that for several reasons, but in my case with sheep, I found that when I go over 2,000 animals per acre, the number of dung beetles and worms that surface after I have been to an area with them increases really fast.
Yes,
you can see if you go around, if you know what you look for, like the dung being brought to the soil, worm castings and dung beetle, you can see it. If you know what you're looking for, you can see it. And in my case, it takes 2,000 to 3,000 animals per acre. I'm not always able to do that because of several reasons. But anyway, even with sheep, I can see.
Yes, it's a very good point you're making. I always say there's a threshold you have to go over in terms of stock density for a big improvement in your land. You can go to very high densities, but not much will happen, particularly I've seen that in arid land where you have a lot of bare ground. You can go to high densities, high impact, But if you don't go to an extremely high density, the impact on the land is not enough to stimulate the grasses to reseed and the land to cover up. So you have to go to extremely high densities. But once you've achieved that, a very high density in these arid areas, you probably have to do it once in 5 years, I'm just guessing. And in the interim, what you have to do is your density has to be high enough to graze non-selectively. But in certain cases, you have to get to extreme high density. And that creates a problem on bare ground in arid areas. And the only way one can get over that is to initially somehow to have like a roaming feedlot. We have cattle, you feed them hay on these bare areas and you move them around. And once you have enough grass growing, then it's much easier to increase the productivity of the land. But you have to go over a certain threshold, which is very high, to get that improvement.
Mr. Zietsman, would you say that if you can't go high enough, it would be safer to play in lower densities, or would you, or it makes it even worse?
The problem with the lower densities, I think it's because of one is trying to get better body condition of the cattle, on the cattle or the sheep. And I think that's a mistake. I think one has to go to these very high densities. And the other thing one has to understand is if you go to these, what I was talking about, in my case, I doubled my stocking rate immediately. I had cattle on rented ground. And when I went over to these very high densities, because of better utilization, I had to double my stocking rate, my number of cattle I had. The calving rate came down from about 85% down to 70%. But if you double your stocking rate, at 70%, you're getting 140% calving rate. So that's another way to look at it. The same piece of land.
But that's another thing that you repeat all the time, which is not everything that matters can be measured. And not everything that can be measured matters.
Exactly.
Because the people that are looking at a production per animal, when you have a drop of 15, 20, 30%, they think that that's huge. And they can't see that actually they double their stocking rate.
Exactly. They double or triple the stocking rate. If you go to these high stocking rates, even with a lower stocking rate. And then the other thing that one has to keep in mind is that in terms of land, the expense of land, the capital invested in land in many ranching areas is very, very high per animal.
Yeah.
So if you can double or triple your stocking rate, then it pays you to feed them more, because you're getting a higher production, but your capital on land hasn't increased. So you can afford to increase the food, the supplementation to those cattle.
But again, you went against the grain again, because you talk about supplementation with trees. You care about trees, which is not very common in ranches. And trees that can help the land, trees that can be used as fodder for the animals. And also you talk about a very small use of supplementation for the animal's rumen, which is a sort of a what's that, oil. It's a
protein or urea or a cotton seed or something like that, some natural protein, and with maybe urea if it's cheap enough. It's just to get the microbes in the rumen to be able to digest the grass. That's the only reason you do that. And by doing that, you can increase intake of grass up to 30 or 40% just by doing that small amount of supplement that you get. You're actually supplementing, you're feeding the microbes, not the animal. And then the microbes feed the animal.
How much are we talking about, and what could we use if one wants to go like as natural as possible?
As natural as I think whatever is available, a lot of the byproducts like cottonseed meal or soya cake or something like that would be a good option, but it's a little bit more expensive, or a combination of that with urea, which is a bit less expensive in terms of the amount of nitrogen that you have in urea. So a combination of that would be a good option. And I think someone that's done a lot of work on that is an Australian. I don't know whether you've heard about him, Terry McCosker.
No.
He did a lot of work on urea in Australia. If you can Google that, Terry McCosker, he talks about the McCosker brew, where he goes to very high levels of urea. Very, very effective and very cheap.
And in doing that, you have a double or triple your stocking rate, and you also make sure that you're using all of even the poor quality grasses and the dry grasses in the dry season.
Absolutely is. And the other thing that one should identify is the fact that in very dry areas, very arid areas, you will have a longer recovery period after grazing, as opposed to more humid areas like you have or I have. In my area, and probably in your area as well, at certain times of the year when body condition is very is important for cattle, like when you're calving and breeding, then I shorten the recovery period, but I still graze non-selectively. So the grasses haven't recovered totally, but the nutritional value of those grasses is much higher than if I had a longer recovery period. So in those cases that you return much quicker. You have a very high nutrition, but you graze non-selectively. And under those conditions where you graze those grasses, you overgrazing to a certain degree because the roots haven't recovered totally in terms of energy content of the roots. What you will get if you do it non-selectively is your better grasses. They will increase in number. That's very important to understand that. It's counterintuitive, but that's what happens.
Explain that a bit further, please. Why does that happen?
Okay, so because most of your grasses that are now being overgrazed under conventionally are your more palatable grasses. And it just happens to be that your more palatable grasses, from my experience, also have a better root system and can store much more energy. So those grasses, if you needed better body condition and you return quicker, all your grasses haven't recovered totally in terms of the root reserves, in terms of energy. But your better grasses will have a better recovery in terms of roots. So if you graze non-selectively, they have a competitive advantage, and they will increase, and your other grasses will decrease. So by doing that, and what you would have to do, you'd have to alternate as well. So areas that you grazed very intensively 1 year, you'll give a longer recovery period the following year, because in the most seasonal rainfall areas, you also need a drought reserve, a dry period reserve. So you can alternate those areas.
I want to come back to that, but just give me a sec. When you graze non-selectively, and because the better grasses, they have more root reserve, when you graze them equally, they receive more sun, and they can respond to more sun quicker because they have more reserves. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And also you're improving the fertility of the soil. So they have a competitive advantage because your better grasses require better conditions, soil conditions, and better nutrition. And they will have the competitive advantage, and they will increase.
Now, coming back to what you're saying, how you started planning for longer recovery. I think it will be useful if you define properly recovered as opposed to rest.
Yes, so there's it depends on the environment as well. If you're in a very arid environment, very dry environment, I would go for the longer recovery periods. In other words, a very long recovery periods. In parts of the deserts of northern Mexico, they go up to 18 months. So you've automatically built in a drought reserve into that. But in your more arid areas, the quality of the grazing doesn't decline so much as in the more humid areas like you have or I have. So the recovery period from a grass point of view, the longer it is within reason, the better it is for the grasses. But from a nutritional point of view for the cattle, in more humid areas, you have to have a shorter recovery period at certain times. And that's as long as you do it, as I said, non-selectively, you will increase your better grasses. So, and then what I do is that maybe I can give you an example. In my environment, my rainy season starts about middle of November, and I get rain for about 4 months up to the middle of March. So at the end of March, April, when there's no more chance of rain, I do an assessment of how much grass I have and what drought reserve I need. So I have a drought reserve. Although my rains start about the middle of November, I have a drought reserve up until the middle of January, just to make sure. Because once in maybe 20 years, your rains will maybe only start at the end of December. So one has to cater for that. So how I do that is I measure the intake of the grass by cattle by using cattle days per hectare. One cattle is one livestock unit. How many days per hectare they graze? So that gives you an indication of how much grass they've taken. So what I can do is initially, when you start at the end of the growing season, you can graze some strips in your dry season, and you measure the cattle days per hectare. In other words, the density of the grass, the amount of grazing you've got available. And you multiply that by days, and you know how many cattle you can carry. And if you have a dry season, it'll tell you early that you have to get rid of some cattle. And in most cases, you will have to increase cattle numbers if you can. And in certain areas, we have a lot of bush encroachment. You can also use that dry season reserve if you don't graze it. In the middle of the rainy season, you can give it a cool fire and just burn that grazing off if necessary. So that's my approach. But the cattle days per hectare is a very easy measurement of how much grass you have.
No, I got you. And then you plan for destocking or getting more animals.
Exactly. So the quicker if you have to destock, the quicker you do it, the fewer animals you have to get rid of. The longer you wait, the more animals you have to get rid of. So it's very important to make that assessment as early as possible.
And that gives you an advantage as well because you're selling your animals in good body condition before everyone else.
Absolutely, exactly, yes. You're not selling them when you have to sell them, but you're selling them at a period that suits you.
Mr. Zietsman, a question about that. Do you see an advantage of buying, because I think it was your brother that bought a bull that was in a slaughterhouse. Do you see advantage in looking for animals that are being discarded because people are not looking for the same thing that we are?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think our best animals are being culled, being slaughtered. Yeah. Because we're looking for different criteria, yes.
But one must be developing a very good eye for these animals.
Yes, I would say so. And what it would probably be the case would be your indigenous breeds, your criou breeds. That's where I would look for that type of bull. Or sheep.
Yeah, in sheep gets a bit more difficult because of the wool. Sometimes the visual appraisal gets a bit distorted by the wool. But I've seen it. People culling animals because they're not the biggest, for instance.
Exactly. Yes. You see, this is the thing. One has to understand that in any herd, what would you say would be the difference in terms of size and cattle? I would say the difference between your smallest cow and your largest cow in most herds would be about 25 to 30%. Yeah. Okay, so that gives you a sort of benchmark to work with. Now, animals to be equally efficient of different size, they have to grow in proportion to their size. So if you have a bull that that's 30% heavier, larger frame-wise than one of the smaller bulls, he has to be 30% heavier and grow 30% faster. So he has to grow in proportion to his size. But the problem is animals can't eat in proportion to their size. The larger they get, the smaller the percentage of intake is. If you look at elephant, they've got a very high intake, but relative to their size, they've got a very small intake if you compare them with mice. And that's what gives you your sheep, for instance. Your sheep are much more efficient than cattle, and that's also related to size, the intake. So your sheep might have a 4 or 5% intake, I'm just guessing, in terms of grass, whereas cattle might have a 2 or 3% intake. And that makes them much more efficient. So the higher the intake is relative to size, the more efficient the animal is.
Yeah, perhaps I'm going off on a tangent here, but I think for people interested in building a flock, or doesn't matter if it's a cow or sheep, but if they're interested in building good genetics, adapted genetics, I think we have an opportunity in choosing from farms that are culling animals because they have a different standard that we have. It might be cheaper. You might be able to buy more animals. And then it brings me to another question. How fast can we improve a herd or a flock using your approach?
One generation.
It's really fast, yeah.
if you make the right combinations, for instance, if you make the right combination in terms of breeds, one generation is going to make a very, very big difference. And then it's a little bit longer time. Selection starts taking in. Then it's a question of selection. But initially, the first combination you make, if you're going to breed your own herd of cattle or flock of sheep, is that first combination you make that's going to make the biggest difference by far.
Yeah, I think the difficulty that I have is I simply can't find people that are grass-fed only. Pretty much everyone that works with sheep in my area, they feed them total mixed rations and things like that. So it
Yes.
makes it difficult for me to find. For instance, I would like to bring a ram that is has a good carcass, for instance, but it needs to be a good carcass produced on grass, not on feed.
Yeah.
And it's been a bit difficult to find that. Yeah.
Yeah, even if they do feed, I would think it's probably a little bit more difficult with sheep, but with cattle, for instance, I would just have a look at the package, how full that package is.
Yeah.
Even if it's fed, the fuller the package, the better the animal would be.
That holds true even if it's being fed with total mixed rations.
Yes, it does hold true. Particularly, yes, it does. So the animals that are earlier maturing will be fuller, they'll be fatter, and they'll be full of body condition, full package.
The conundrum that I'm in is that I found Criollo sheep. They're very parasite resistant, but they're smaller. They don't produce much meat. So I would have to bring a male that would bring a better early maturing carcass. But I'm struggling with that a little bit. Can't find people.
Well,
No, you go.
Okay, the other thing I would say is just think of your goal again. What is your goal? Is your goal bigger sheep, or is your goal more profit per hectare?
Profit per hectare.
Yes. So that might change your view a little bit of how you look at size. But in a case like that, where you have Creole sheep like that, and even with cattle, you can cross them with something else, and then you sell all those animals. And you have a smaller flock that you maintain your Creole breed.
Yeah, so let me explain that to you. I'm not interested in absolute size, but what happens is that the Criollo sheep, they might take over 1 year to produce an animal to be killed.
Okay, I understand. Yes, yeah. So in a case like that, I think you could crossbreed them, terminal cross.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking. Mr. Zietsman.
So small percentage.
No, you go.
Yes, sorry.
No, you go.
No, small percent. So small percentage you would keep pure Creole, and the rest you would cross.
I can use your approach to keep a Criollo flock as a genetic base and still multi-sire and still use all of your approach.
Yes.
But I can then bring a male from another breed or mixed male, doesn't matter, that will bring meat, and then I can use for one generation and then restart again and see if I can bring that quality into the herd. That's what I was thinking to do.
You could do that. Yes. It'll be composite breeding. It makes sense. Yes. With cattle, you can do that. So I'm sure with sheep as well.
Yeah, I'm looking for the different compositions to try and achieve that, because it's not a matter of size, it's a matter of being able to close a cycle of production within 12 months.
Yes, I understand. Yeah. So it's actually maturity rate, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So when they feed the animals, it's difficult to find the early maturing ones, because they always look very full because they're being fed total mixed rations.
Yes.
Well, I'm training my eye to that. Mr. Zietsman, let me ask you something. How did you? Because I'm curious about the opposition that you had to face during your professional life. and then you wrote this book.
Yes.
And your book is, like you say that sometimes in some of your classes, but I think it's true. We almost always have to go against what we're being told to do by the industry. And your book is,
Yes.
and your book is a very important tool for those who are brave enough to go against the grain. And I wonder what
Yes.
led you to write a book like that, because probably you were told that not many people would follow your approach because it's so out of the mainstream. Tell me a
Yes,
little bit about the story of the book.
Okay, well, I was going to write down my experiences. I thought it was very important for me, from a personal point of view, to write everything down onto a book. I think, generally speaking, a new idea takes about, well, they say about 50 years for it to become common practice. And I can't wait another 50 years, so I had to write a book. So that it's all on paper there, so people can. It's a legacy I leave behind. So I'm happy to have done that. I think that was the main reason.
And also when you turn out to be right, because you are right, the book has a date,
Yes.
and people can go back and say he was saying that in the early.
Yes, it's not. Yeah, it's not that I'm right. It's that I'm very fortunate that I've been able to read nature correctly. It's nature that's correct.
But right. I think when you have the chance to learn from people like you, our learning curve gets easier, because what took you years to distill in terms of being able to read clues from nature, when you share them, it makes other people's path much shorter.
Yes, 100%. It's taken me 50 years from where I started to where I am now, more than 50 years. So it's 50 years condensed. Someone reading the book could probably do what I did in 50 years, or the ideas I had in 50 years, could probably do it in 5 years.
No, it's a gift. The book is really, really good. And the sense that I got from the book is that we are wasting our capacities. We are capable of so much more.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
You see, we've been so led astray by academics. That's been the big problem. Academics have led us astray. The biggest laboratory, the best laboratory, is on your property, on your farm. You with your sheep there. That's where you observe and can make decisions and understand how nature works. If you're sitting between four walls and behind a computer, you cannot make those observations. It's impossible.
And also,
that's where the problem lies.
And also, they recommend a lot of things, but they're not on the land to see what happens with their recommendations.
Absolutely. No, exactly. I think most of the people that are in those situations today have learned from something else was in the same situation. They were never on the land. So that is a problem. There's a disconnect between what is happening on the land and what's happening in the classroom.
But recently, you've been awarded an award from the Land Rehabilitation Society from South Africa. Do you think that's the book and your ideas catching up?
I think it is, yes, it is. And particularly if I have to look at it from a bigger point of view picture, as in Latin America, for instance, in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, Colombia, those people have taken over. They can carry on. There's a momentum now that they can't break. It's just getting bigger and bigger.
Let me ask you
something. Nice to be able to see that.
You've been to Brazil before. Why do you think Brazil was slow in adopting your ideas? Because I see it in Paraguay, I see it in Colombia, I see it in Mexico, but in Brazil we do have like we spoke about her. We have Aline and her husband Marcus. They've been leading the ultra high density movement, yes. And they're doing very well. But they've been faced with a lot of opposition. Yes. People are actually being nasty to them, very unprofessional, very unethical with them. Why do you think Brazil resisted that much?
I really don't I really don't know. There must be something with the Brazilian culture, I suppose. I wouldn't like to say too much. What I do know is that in Brazil, things are done on a very, very large scale.
Yes.
That's a fact. Worldwide, Brazil does everything on a very large scale. So that might have something to do with it.
I think there's also we have a culture. We have a culture that we hold very dear the animals and the breeds. For instance, Brazilians, most Brazilians are, I don't know why, but they're very attached to the Nelore. How do you pronounce that in English? Nelore, the Nelore breed.
Nelore, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not very adapted, is it?
Well, it's an adapted animal, but I think it lacks. There are good animals within the Nelore breed, but generally speaking, I think one of the things they lack, in particular, is the foundation, which is body condition, inherent body condition, and hormonal balance. I think they lack that. So, but there is an attachment all over the world. You will find people that are attached to certain breeds, but in Brazil, I think it's exaggerated. The Nelore is the Nelore. A lot of people are attached to the law, and I can see it. Very good friends of, we're talking about Aline. I think Aline is changing now, but she's also been caught in that trap. And I've also been caught in that trap, but I've fortunately got out of it. But a lot of people attach more, they pay more attention to breed than the type of animal.
These folks that you say that they're carrying on the ultra high density grazing approach in Argentina, in all these countries in South America, what's their approach to animals? Are they all bringing animals from Africa to bring the adaptation?
Well, that's what I've suggested to them, and it's working very well. You see, the Mashona breed has been in the United States since 1992, but people didn't realize what value they had. And particularly the Mashona, because I call them the African Angus. They're black and they're polled. So they combine very well with the Angus. So it makes a very big difference. The Angus in most parts of the world, like Mexico and those places, they're not adapted enough. They're good animals, potentially. But if you combine them with something that's adapted and you complement those traits, then you have a very good animal. So particularly the Mashona and also the Boran, which is a zebu, that's available now in Paraguay. And I think it's moving into Brazil as well. They animals that have, all the African breeds are unique for a very good reason. I call it aggravated natural selection. So natural selection has been taking place in Africa for hundreds of years. But it's aggravated because of people. People are using their cattle for draft, they're milking them, so they have a very limited grazing period. So animals that have survived over hundreds of years have a very high intake and have very good inherent body condition. And I think that's a big plus that African breeds have. And your Creole breeds as well, that you will find in Latin America. I think it's exactly the same. They've adapted to those conditions and they've had to live under very difficult conditions. So it's a unique genotype that we have there.
Yes, we have the Jesuits. They came to Brazil and they have their missions, and they were trying to convert some of the indigenous population, and they have huge ranches and farms to try and do that. But every time there was a crisis, they lost their flock or their herd, and these animals they were set free many times in crisis, and they became very adapted. That's the breed of sheep that I'm mainly dealing with now, but I'm trying to create a composite from them. But yeah, we have the cattle as well, and we also have horses, which leads me to another question about the non-selective grazing. Do you think it's advisable to always have a mixed herd or leading follower sort of situation with horses or other animals together with cattle or sheep?
I think that would be the ideal situation. But I think with the control we have over cattle, I don't see a place for sheep in a cattle herd. I see a place with sheep where they can follow cattle or move ahead of cattle, where the cattle do the improvement, and sheep you use to make money. Sheep can't improve the land as much as cattle. So I would never put sheep and cattle together. I would manage them separately.
I was about to ask you, when would you put one or another to graze a head?
It depends, I suppose. Environment. We have in Africa, we have very tall grasses, so maybe that's not ideal for sheep. So maybe follow the cattle 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the cattle, they follow the sheep, or in environments where it's possible, let the sheep graze selectively ahead of the cattle.
And then the cattle will do the non-selective grazing afterwards.
Exactly, the non-selective grazing and the land improvement. The sheep make you money.
And the sheep that go, the sheep going ahead wouldn't be in ultra-high density grazing.
No, selective. You put them in large areas ahead. The cattle follow them.
Mr. Zietsman, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. You've been very kind with your knowledge, with your time. We tried to do this a few times, and we had some problems with the time zone and equipment and all that sort of stuff. Where do you see, as a final comment, what do you think we need to? How would we enable more people to break from the mainstream paradigm and use more the things that you've been teaching?
That's a very difficult one, Enrique. I think the big paradigm shift has to come from the goal. We have to understand what the goal is and what the role of cattle is: land improvement and efficient grass conversion. I think one has to. It's a very difficult one. I would have thought that economics would play a role, but I think we're still far away from that. People are still mining their land and they're still making money, and a lot of people inherit land. I think if you have to buy your land, it's a different situation. So I think it's just a question of we have to wait for people to catch up.
I think I've been thinking about that a lot, and the way you talk about the veld, you're belonging to the place, because you talk about maximum sustainable profit as something important, but not to the detriment of the land's health. And I think you're belonging. I think your belonging to the land makes it easier for you to understand maximum sustainable profit. Whereas most people, at least in Brazil, maybe for survival reasons, they are they're focusing too much on the money, and the land pays the price.
Yes, I think we have to understand we have a moral obligation to improve the land as well. We have to leave the land in a better situation that we inherited it for our children and grandchildren. I think that's it is a moral obligation as well. A lot of people don't understand it, or they allow economics money to decide how they manage the land. I think it's a question of catching up. I've been very frustrated since 1995, 12th of January. But in the last 10 years, I can see there's a very big movement in the right direction. And I think that's going to increase. It's just going to gather momentum.
Well, you were definitely ahead of your time, Mr. Zietsman. Definitely. It pays.
Well, I've always been a bit of a rebel, so I suppose one needs to be rebellious to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But I'm fortunate in the sense that since childhood I knew exactly what I wanted to do. It's been my mission.
It's been a blessing. When you can work with your vocation, it's very important. Well, I hope the ultra high density grazing in Brazil will bring you to teach here, and I hope to be there. My contribution is with this sort of work that we did today. I farm in a very small scale. That's another blind spot that Brazil has, which is doesn't believe in solutions coming from the smaller scale. I think that's a blind spot, because many solutions, many smart people, many innovative people come from the edges, from the small farms. But in Brazil, because of the huge abattoirs, because of the huge properties, these people are usually looked down upon. And but anyway, that's my contribution. Yes. I think soon people will bring you over, because it's taking off. There's many people adopting it. And I think they will benefit a lot if you come because, well, the genetic adaptation and all of the small details that we talked today about, they're still lacking in some places, in some areas, in some farmers.
Yeah.
Even though the movement, like you
Yes.
said, is catching up really fast in Brazil too. Unfortunately, we're facing a bit of a how do you say a pushback in a non-ethical way. But anyway, that's not our problem. That's on their account. It's not our problem. Some people are attacking ultra high density grazing. They say it's only a way of putting cattle to graze in smaller and smaller strips, which is not true. It's not that. No. That's a tool. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway.
And you're 100% correct. And in passing, you were talking about the momentum it's taking, and I would just like to acknowledge the fact that Eileen, who's in our group, and her husband, Marcos, is it?
Yes.
I would like to acknowledge the fact that, as far as I know, they've got the largest herd under ultra high density grazing in the world, and that's a great achievement.
You know, they're spreading, they're teaching, there's people following, and also, like you said, because they have a commitment to their land, and they've been viable doing this. People can say what they want, but they can prove.
Yes.
And in a very harsh environment as well. I think she's going now for 7 months without rain.
Yes. Yeah, for us it's natural 8 months without rain. It's average, yeah. She's in a very harsh environment because I think the quality of the grazing declines a lot because of the higher rainfall she has as well. And another challenge that you have in Brazil is where you deforest, you take out all those trees and plant grass. It's not sustainable. Eventually, you'll have to go back to a situation where you have a savanna type situation, where you have trees that have create a very different microclimate and increase soil fertility. It's going to be essential to do that. And there are trees that one can plant. There are trees in Africa here that grow very well under those conditions, and they complement the grass very well.
In my research, Mr. Zietsman, usually the fodder trees, they come from temperate climates. It's not very easy to find. And I'm sure we would have in the rainforest in Brazil, we would have many trees that cattle and sheep can forage. But we just don't have the culture to document those trees.
Yes. And apart from the feed that the trees produce, it's what they do in the microclimate, how they change the microclimate and improve soil fertility. So just from that point of view, it's worthwhile to have many more trees.
Well, we're going on a tangent again, but do you think that people don't do that because it's expensive to set up those areas, to plant trees and have to fence them off? And do you think it's a cost problem, or do you think it's a cost challenge, or do you think it's a paradigm change?
It's a paradigm change. Paradigm change.
Mr. Zietsman, thank you very much for your lessons, your time, your generosity again. And I wish at least that's my goal with this conversation with you, is that more people in Brazil can find you and adopt your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eureka, and it's very nice to have spoken to you. And I'm sure we'll see each other again and we'll become very big friends.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Zietsman.